Hello and welcome back to Eagle Forum's YouTube channel. I'm Colleen Holcomb, joined by Schlafly Cori, and we're here today to discuss episode 5 of Mrs. America entitled, this is a mouthful, Phyllis and Fred, Brenda and Marc. This episode, I thought the series really took a dark turn with this episode, and we've discussed this before, but this episode was particularly I thought it was intentionally emasculating of your father, and you've talked about that before. The show begins with your father being interviewed, and there's a reference to him as being Mr. Phyllis Schlafly. Can you just tell us how your father really felt about your mother and her activism, and how he felt about being Phyllis Schlafly's husband?
My father had a keen sense of humor, and he loved and really relished being called Mr. Phyllis. And I think the local newspaper, the Alton Telegraph, frequently would refer to him as Mr. Phyllis in a jocular sort of way. He did do a big interview for the paper that was done on his retirement after 50 years of being a prominent lawyer in Alton, Illinois. It seemed as though the episode shows him as being demoted out of his own office, as though he's moved into a different, lesser office space, which is pretty odd because he was the office. The name of the firm was Schlafly, Godfrey, and Fitzgerald. So he was the top name in the firm. And no, he never got demoted out of the corner office.
Yeah, it seems like there's a clear agenda there, and that's, of course, part of the artistic license that we see a lot. There seems to be an ongoing tension in this episode about your mother going to law school and taking the LSAT. Can you comment on that at all? Was that realistic?
Well, it was a matter of family discussion and debate because my mother did go take the LSAT and did apply to go to Washington University Law School. And she did reveal it as a great surprise at the dining room table. And I think my father was in shock. And after all, my mother did so many different things in so many areas, and the law was his domain. So did he feel threatened at that moment? Probably, or wasn't quite sure, but it didn't last very long before he came back and realized that Phyllis Schlafly needed to have a JD at the end of her name so that she could be taken, respected for her opinions. Because after all, it was Senator Birch Bayh who refused to debate Phyllis Schlafly because she was not a lawyer. And I think my parents realized and came to understand that that would be the best way to approach it. And my father certainly helped her along in all of her law school studies. I think he very much, though, wanted to keep his office as his domain, and he did. She never joined him in his office. And all those images where they show in the movie of her going into his office, that's not possible. It was clearly that was his domain.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Senator Bayh, because in the series, it really makes it sound like it's Brenda Feigan-Fasteau and some of the feminists who are antagonizing Phyllis because she doesn't have a degree. Now, the show made it seem like Phyllis was intimidated by debating, in this case, Brenda Feigan-Fasteau, because she did have a law degree. I can't imagine Phyllis being intimidated by a debate even before she was.
I can't either. One of the reasons why she was so successful is because she was super confident. She went into every time she went into a speech or debate, she is the sort of person who over-prepared, over-analyzed, knew her subject backward and forward cold, and her preparation was extensive before any kind of interview or debate. So that's taking liberties to try, because I think they're trying to diminish her. They're parts of the show that show her as quite intelligent and smart. And then there are other parts that try to make her seem not kind of silly or dumb. And I think that was one of the parts where they tried to show her as stupid, because it's easier to not like your opponent if you can call him stupid.
Yeah. You're right, and they made her seem like she was intimidated, which I can't imagine Phyllis ever being intimidated. And I remember—
No, she intimidated other people.
Oh, she sure did. Yeah, with good reason. You're right, because she was always prepared. I remember hearing that so often on Capitol Hill. We heard from several legislators who were in Congress who had been in their state houses, who had seen Phyllis debate the ERA, and one of them I remember talking about trying to discourage his colleague from debating her because he said she will eat your lunch, and that's exactly what happened. But I think it's interesting in the show how they seem to show Phyllis, even though the feminists had all of the first ladies, all of the presidents, all in both parties, all of the leadership was in favor of the ERA, certainly all of Hollywood, but they show Phyllis as somehow having the ability to frame the debate. As your father said, she needed to change the shape of the table when this debate was proposed. Was any of that accurate? They made it seem like the debate was initially between Brenda and Phyllis, and that it was Phyllis's idea to have a couples debate. Was that accurate? Is that more licensed?
Well, what I always heard about that debate is that Tom Snyder, who very much was a showman, wanted to create a show with two couples on either side of it, that would be more fun than having just two women on the debate. And that it was a show that he created and wanted to do. And subsequently, there was a similar situation on Good Morning America when David Hartman purposely chose two couples, one Phyllis and Fred and the other Bella and Martin Abzug. So this was, I think this was something in the 70s, just trying to create something different to frame around ERA, to show it in a different way other than women bickering among themselves.
Well, and it certainly did, the actual debate, not what was shown in this series. In the debate as it's depicted in Mrs. America, your father, or actually it's the host who mentions your father's quote about Phyllis thanking her supporters in her congressional race, and then your father thanking the people who didn't vote for her. You mentioned his sense of humor, but that's not the way it's presented in the program.
It's presented kind of grim, as though he really wanted her to lose. But I think what misses, and sometimes, humor doesn't translate well. But at the time, my father always thought it was a good joke. And he used this joke a number of times. And my mother always laughed at it, which was, my father would say, my wife thanks all those who voted for her, and I thank all those who did not. And it was always presented as a good laugh and a chuckle. And what I think the show misses is that Fred Schlafly fully supported Phyllis Schlafly, his wife, in every possible way. They were not contentious, but two peas in a pod. And this support came financially, emotionally, spiritually, and what's critical for their relationship, intellectually. They had a true intellectual partnership, and they really matched each other intellectually in discussion of the finer issues, and they like to debate between themselves on the various issues. So I think this portrayal of a husband who, with a showy wife that he is somehow envious of, misses the mark of why this tremendously happy marriage gave my mother the confidence to go out and do what she did. Because as she said later on, it wouldn't have been worth it to me if Fred weren't supportive.
Sure. And what a disservice to so many young women, because I remember hearing Phyllis talk about the support that she had in her marriage. And I remember as a single woman thinking that's exactly what I want for myself. So it really is a shame to not offer that beautiful
well, I think ultimately, though, you come away with this idea in the movie that the feminists are anti-marriage, that marriage is a millstone for women as opposed to a source of great comfort. I mean, the sex shown within marriage is nasty, brutish, and short. The sex outside of marriage is exciting. And we see that in this episode where Brenda and Marc have a sex scene, but it's only a good sex scene because she has betrayed him with an extramarital affair. So this diminution of fidelity, I think, comes across loud and clear, that somehow fidelity is not to be celebrated. Now, for those of us who perceive marriage as a source of great comfort, fidelity is one of the most critical elements of it. And the idea of celebrating infidelity and celebrating betrayal is one of the big reasons why the feminist movement lost steam, because who wants to live like that?
That's absolutely true. Now, it's a shame that the full footage of the debate isn't available online, but in the fictionalized debate that's shown in the series, we see Phyllis being depicted as making up a case, as kind of stumbling over her talking points and her introduction.
And her husband throwing her under the bus.
Right, right. Yeah, and you see Phyllis and Fred looking very unhappy when, I don't know, I'm sure you've seen some of what is available. The footage that's available that I've seen shows Fred and Phyllis happy and laughing. And in fact, it's Marc and Brenda who look sour. And it appears that Brenda, again, the footage I've seen, all that's available, shows that it's Brenda who was not necessarily making things up, but who was offering information that wasn't necessarily credible. And she was challenged by your father and by the host. Now, do you think that this was an accurate representation of the debate as you remember it, or?
Well, the fictional story has to make the feminists the stars of it, and has to demonize Phyllis Schlafly. I mean, that has been their purpose from it. The beginning is to pretend that Phyllis was, quote, a fearmonger or subject to hyperbole or making things up. And they often throw those words out without ever any evidence that she ever did any of those things. Because actually, the things that she predicted and were called fear-mongering in the 1970s came to pass later on. She was prescient.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Now, would your mother ever make up a case in support of her argument?
My mother never made up anything. She was always fact-based in everything she did, and she always provided supporting documentation for her arguments.
The episode ends with a particularly upsetting scene as your parents are walking back to their hotel room after the debate, and your father storms out after, this is the much-teased line, "I let you run around this country for your cause."
And she says, "I've raised your children." I mean, that's right there. That's just not a line. It would always have been an hour that they were united in purpose, and flinging that kind of accusation it mischaracterizes what their relationship was.
Is anything about that realistic? I think you've addressed it quite a bit, but your father's being upset about your mother's travel, or your mother, yeah, you just said she would never say your children. And then it ends with your mother slapping herself to keeping herself from crying, which is particularly interesting. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I think that once again, the producers were overlaying their own desires. They wanted to slap Phyllis, so instead they had Phyllis slap herself.
There seems to be a lot of violence against Phyllis in these episodes. Very interesting. Well, we'll see more of that, unfortunately, in the next few episodes. But thank you again, Anne, for joining us, and we'll look forward to discussing episode 6.
My pleasure, Colleen.